Ancient Egypt, one of the greatest civilizations in history. But who or what killed its last pharaoh, Cleopatra? A verdict of suicide by snakebite has been accepted unchallenged for over 2,000 years. But can science uncover an entirely different explanation? A team of investigators will attempt to use modern techniques to crack the case. Did Cleopatra take her own life, or was she murdered? Tonight, Unearthing Ancient Secrets investigates the mysterious death of Cleopatra. Cleopatra, Pharaoh of Egypt, one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen, and lover of two of the most powerful men in ancient Rome, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But in 30 BC, her 20-year reign ended violently, her plan to protect Egypt from the might of Rome in tatters. The grandnephew of Julius Caesar, Octavian, had conquered her empire. Her lover Mark Antony was dead, and Octavian had imprisoned Cleopatra. She faced a terrible choice: live and be humiliated by her Roman enemy, or take her own life and die with her dignity intact. History records her decision. She killed herself with a deadly snake.
I think that the death of Cleopatra is probably her greatest moment. What a fabulous exit.
But many experts and scholars think that there is much about the story of Cleopatra's death that doesn't add up.
The idea that she would commit suicide just doesn't hold water.
Could the story of Cleopatra's suicide be a 2,000-year-old cover-up?
No Ptolemy has ever committed suicide.
So what is the truth behind the myths surrounding Cleopatra's death?
Did she really commit suicide, or was it possibly a homicide?
Pat Brown, one of America's leading criminal profilers, believes there may be more to the story.
As a cold case homicide investigator, I noticed this particular crime scene and said, this is very unusual. There seems something wrong with the way it is described she died, and I'm just not sure I quite believe it.
For over a decade, Brown has profiled some of America's most notorious criminals, including the Washington Snipers. She wants to use this experience to do something she's never done before: solve a 2,000-year-old case using modern forensic science.
I've done cases that are 20 years old. I've done cases that are 30 years old. This one's a couple thousand years old. So I'd say this is about as cold a case as you're going to get.
Brown and an international team of expert witnesses will investigate the case using all the techniques available to a modern crime unit. Using these scientific tools, they will uncover an incredible story of conspiracy, incest, and even murder. Pat Brown begins her investigation in Alexandria, the city Cleopatra ruled from over 2,000 years ago. For Brown, the city is more than Cleopatra's home. It's the crime scene.
One of the most important things you do in any cold case is to go to that crime scene, because if you don't go there, you don't even know what you're looking at.
Cleopatra's Alexandria was one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. But today, virtually nothing remains of the city as she would have known it. 2,000 years of wars, earthquakes, and tidal waves means that the city's royal palaces and famous monuments have all disappeared into the huge natural harbor. Somewhere here are the remains of Cleopatra's palace and her mausoleum, the place where she died. Now, almost nothing is left of the ancient crime scene. The mausoleum is thought of as lost for good. Brown needs help to build a more accurate picture of the place where Cleopatra died. So she turns to a man who has spent a decade exploring the remains of Cleopatra's city. Underwater archaeologist Professor Jean-Yves Empereur.
The continent line, the coastline is here.
Okay.
And it's very different from what we see now.
Today, Alexandria's coastline bears little resemblance to the city in Cleopatra's time. But Professor Empereur's research paints a picture of how the palace district might have looked. And most importantly, he is able to do something until recently thought impossible. He can identify the site of Cleopatra's mausoleum.
So how far a distance would it be from the exact palace to the mausoleum, would you guess?
Exactly, we don't know, but not far. It's some hundreds of meters only.
So we have a palace here, a mausoleum there.
Yes.
Which is,
Yeah.
she could then easily get back and forth between the two of them.
Yes, of course.
With Empereur's evidence, Brown decides to rebuild the place where Cleopatra died. She will draw on the details of Alexandria's ancient maps, archaeology, and modern underwater survey data. She sends the information to a team of computer graphics specialists. The team will create a 3D architectural model of Cleopatra's palace complex, including the mausoleum.
I like to reconstruct all crime scenes because if I can't see the crime scene and see how it looked, I can't see what would have happened.
While Brown waits for the reconstruction, the investigation takes her to the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, built to commemorate one of the most famous academic institutions in history, the ancient Library of Alexandria. Built by Cleopatra's dynasty, it was said to have held over 700,000 scrolls. It was one of the landmarks that made the city great. Brown has come here to enlist the help of one of Egypt's leading scholars and expert on Cleopatra's era, Professor Mustafa El-Abadi. She wants to find out exactly what evidence she has to work with. Just as with a modern crime, the investigation will rely heavily on witnesses. Only in this case, their testimony is almost 2,000 years old.
What is the actual first source we have that says anything about Cleopatra?
Well, the sources are actually second-hand sources, even the ancient ones.
Even the ancient ones?
Even the ancient ones.
Professor El-Abadi's news is surprising. There is not one first-hand account of Cleopatra's death. Two accounts are considered reliable, those of Roman historians Cassius and Plutarch. But even these were written a century after Cleopatra died. However, the two accounts do agree on certain things. Both say that Cleopatra was imprisoned inside her mausoleum on the day of her death. Plutarch goes on to describe the scene.
When they opened the doors, they found Cleopatra lying dead upon a golden couch, dressed in her royal robes.
Plutarch suggests that Cleopatra's means of killing herself was a poisonous snake smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figs. Cassius says the snake was concealed in a pitcher. Both describe an alternative scenario, that Cleopatra took poison.
I found there were so many inconsistencies that I couldn't quite put my finger on if this happened or if that happened.
Plutarch was a storyteller, in a sense.
Do you then believe it's possible that he also took artistic license in his writings?
Possibly, yes. Yes, certainly, yes.
From their research, Brown feels the suicide story is far less convincing than she had first thought. Her doubts are even echoed by Plutarch himself, for in his account, he acknowledges he doesn't know exactly how Cleopatra died.
But the truth of the matter, no one knows.
The truth of the matter, no one knows.
Nobody knows. But for certain, we have no means of knowing how she died.
Brown realizes that 2,000 years of history have been built on the shakiest of foundations, rumor and assumption.
We really don't know what happened at the scene. So I'm going to have to go back and analyze what could have occurred at that scene, and does any of that make sense?
For Pat Brown, the investigation is just beginning. While she examines archaeological evidence from Cleopatra's era, she considers all the options. If suicide is unlikely, exactly what or who killed Egypt's last pharaoh? Brown's profile will take her inside the mind of Cleopatra. If Cleopatra had committed suicide, she should fit certain psychological characteristics displayed by most suicide victims.
People commit suicide when they can't stand being alive, when they're in such intolerable pain. There's something about continuing to live. Oh, if they believe that by dying they will gain something that they can't gain otherwise. The question is there anything in Cleopatra's story which fits either?
In 69 BC, Cleopatra was born into a dynasty known as the Ptolemies. As a child, she enjoyed a remarkable education. It was said that she could speak 7 languages and was the only Ptolemy who could speak Egyptian as well as Greek. But there was more to being a Ptolemy than a good education. Being a Ptolemy meant Cleopatra would have had to fight for her right to the throne, for her very survival. It was kill or be killed.
Cleopatra learned very, very well from her family. She learned that if people get in your way, you eliminate them. She's going to learn what works and what doesn't work. And if she wants to be a queen, she's going to have to take in all the methodologies that are going to make her a queen.
But the ancient records reveal something else, that the Ptolemies had no family history of suicide.
That I know of, no Ptolemy has ever committed suicide. Generally speaking, they don't die a peaceful death.
There was no family history of committing suicide, even though there was a family history of murder. So this would have been out of character for her.
Pat Brown is building a psychological profile of Cleopatra. It portrays a woman who would do anything to retain her power. At 18, she inherited the throne and became pharaoh of Egypt. With the crown came marriage to her brother, but he wanted to rule alone and challenged Cleopatra's power. Soon after, he was found dead. Fearing her own assassination, Cleopatra sought the protection of the emerging Roman Empire. She became the lover of Julius Caesar. Soon after, she gave birth to his son. After Caesar's murder in 44 BC, Cleopatra seduced his confidant, Mark Antony. Together, they launched a bid to rule the Roman Empire and failed. From her experience in investigating modern crimes, Brown is beginning to believe that Cleopatra would never have simply given up.
Looking at Cleopatra, one of the most important details is that she never quit fighting. She never gives up. It's not making a lot of sense to me that she would just kill herself at that moment.
Just as she would in a modern case, Brown now wants to combine Cleopatra's psychological profile with evidence from the crime scene. Her graphics team has now finished the 3D reconstruction of ancient Alexandria. Brown is about to be able to visualize something that no one else has seen for 1,700 years. Cleopatra's city is rising from its ocean grave. Based on historical research and archaeological evidence, Pat Brown now has the most accurate possible reconstruction of both Cleopatra's palace and the mausoleum where she died.
Having concluded that Cleopatra is not the type of person to kill herself, I now have to prove it.
Minute by minute, Brown now wants to recreate the events leading up to Cleopatra's death.
When I reconstruct a crime scene, I'm looking to see how is it done? Is it possible for things to be done in this particular location? One should be able to reconstruct the crime scene and have it work.
Brown returns to Plutarch's 2,000-year-old version of events to compare it against what she has already discovered. On the day of her death, Cleopatra was imprisoned in her mausoleum. On her orders, a deadly snake is smuggled into her rooms. She sends a suicide note to her captor, Octavian, who has taken over her palace. Cleopatra allows the snake to bite her. Then her two handmaidens do the same. When they are discovered, the handmaidens are dying, Cleopatra already dead. Two tiny pinpricks are discovered on her arm.
There's just some things that just jump out, red flags, we say. If you're constructing this crime in your mind, can you imagine three women trying to apply a snake to themselves, especially the handmaidens after they see their mistress drop to the floor? I mean, the likelihood of them wanting to grab the snake themselves is, oh, it's a snake. And a poisonous one at that. People are frightened of snakes.
But Brown still needs proof. In search of evidence, she travels to Cairo. She has arranged to meet a leading expert in snake venoms and ancient poisons, Professor David Worrell. He takes her to an area called Abu Rawash, referred to by Egyptians as the Snake Village. If the snakebite story is true, there are very few snakes which could have caused Cleopatra's death.
This is the one to concentrate on. This is the best one, the top candidate, Egyptian cobra. This is Egypt's most impressive venomous snake. It's the largest, it has the most potent venom. The venom is neurotoxic.
Which means what?
Well, the toxins block the transmission of the nerve impulse.
Okay.
So there is a progressive paralysis.
Once struck by the cobra, the venom would first have paralyzed the muscles of her eyes. Then it would have frozen the muscles in her chest and stomach. Finally, she would have suffocated and died. The ordeal would leave little physical evidence on the body.
You would have fang marks.
They're noticeable fang marks?
Yes, although they can be very tiny, even with a large snake.
This description exactly matches the earliest account of Cleopatra's corpse.
Plutarch just said there were two marks, but nothing else.
Plutarch said there were two tiny marks. These descriptions did not suggest that there were any other changes at the site of the bite.
Professor Worrell also believes that one cobra could deliver enough venom to kill all three victims, Cleopatra and her handmaidens.
This amount of venom that we see here, would this be would just a fraction of it be in one bite?
Yes, probably. Okay. It would only inject a few drops at each strike.
So this is a lot of venom.
But all the evidence now suggests that repeated strikes, even up to 10 strikes in a row, can deliver lethal doses of venom.
Professor Worrell's testimony initially seems to support the snakebite theory. But as Brown reviews the 3D reconstruction of the crime scene, she finds a detail which could challenge that theory once and for all. She notices that Cleopatra's mausoleum was very close to her palace, where Octavian was staying.
The mausoleum and the palace, they're just several hundred meters apart. It's a very short walk.
Brown believes that with such a short distance between the two buildings, the suicide note which Cleopatra sent Octavian would have reached him within minutes. The alarm would have been raised and her body discovered almost immediately. That raises the question, how long would the venom from an Egyptian cobra take to kill Cleopatra?
The
most rapid evolution to death that I've experienced has been 2 hours, but shorter times than that have been reported. Could have been as short as 15 or 20 minutes, but much more likely it would have been a matter of a few hours.
History records that Cleopatra's handmaidens died seconds after Octavian's guards arrived. This suggests that all 3 women died within the shortest possible time frame. To Brown, this seems highly unlikely.
If Cleopatra had sent over a note to Octavian, that guard would have been back there very quickly, and he would have found Cleopatra alive.
Brown's investigation seems to undermine history's version of Cleopatra's death. But before she dismisses 2,000 years of firmly held belief, Brown wants to understand one thing. How did the snakebite story come about in the first place? The magnificent Temple of Philae was built by Cleopatra's dynasty, the Ptolemies. Brown meets Professor Saeed Gohari, an expert on the temple. He explains that Philae was dedicated to the goddess Isis.
And you see the figure of goddess Isis everywhere.
For the ancient Egyptians, Isis was the universal mother goddess. But the walls of Philae hold a key piece of evidence which may help the investigation.
Look at this very important relief here, showing Isis in the middle. And she is providing Egypt with water and the plantation. The whole scene being protected by the snake. Can you see the head of the snake?
Right there.
And this relief shows the connection and the relation between Cleopatra and Isis.
The symbol of Isis was the Egyptian cobra. The snake adorned her headdress and symbolized kingship. And when Cleopatra was crowned, she did not only become the queen. To the ancient Egyptians, she also became the living embodiment of Isis herself.
The ancient Egyptian world were dominated by gods. After 3,000 years, the kings were worshipped the same method like gods, and they considered themselves like gods.
As soon as Cleopatra became pharaoh, countless images depicting her as Isis alongside the cobra would have been created. Did the snakebite story arise from a mistake? Did the historians misinterpret Cleopatra's association with the snake?
I think one can certainly draw a parallel between the symbol of kingship and the death of Cleopatra. This very, very dangerous animal, the cobra, which is there to protect the Queen of Egypt, is in fact, in the myth, the ultimate instrument of her death.
For Pat Brown, something falls into place. She believes that the snakebite story is a myth rather than a factual account, and thinks it has its origins in Cleopatra's association with Isis. But if she didn't commit suicide by snakebite, just how did Cleopatra die? Brown decides to investigate the alternative theory suggested by Plutarch, that Cleopatra committed suicide using poison. His account explains how she hid the poison from her captors.
She carried poison about with her in a hollow comb, which she kept hidden in her hair.
In search of proof for the poison theory, Brown turns again to Professor Worrell. He can identify which poisons would have been known and understood in Cleopatra's time. He takes her to a market in Cairo where some of them can still be purchased today.
The really interesting thing here is that in Cleopatra's time, a wide range of poisons were available and understood and were used.
And she would understand them because she was very well educated. She had all the access.
I believe she was an experienced poisoner. I can see up there's the spotted hemlock. This is a plant poison. The active principle is coneine. This is the poison which bumped off poor Socrates in 300 BC, so it was very well known. And it would cause a slow but not too unpleasant death.
You think the number one poison that Cleopatra might have used would have been the hemlock?
That would certainly be a very possible contender.
To test this theory, Brown contacts one of the world's leading poison units. Based in New Zealand, toxicologist Dr. Leo Shep and his team are going to analyze hemlock. First, Dr. Shep makes a highly toxic concentrate from the leaves of the hemlock plant. He wants to determine exactly how much hemlock would have been needed to kill Cleopatra and her handmaidens.
The comb may hold 1 to 2 mils of liquid. She would need 30 mils to kill herself, and an additional 60 mils her servants. It's highly unlikely that hemlock would have been responsible for her death.
The comb story is clearly improbable. Now, Brown wants to know if it was even possible for hemlock to have killed Cleopatra in the few minutes between sending her suicide note and the guards finding her dead. The results suggest that the story just doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny.
That's interesting. But death is typically within hours of ingestion. So it would have taken too long. There would have been signs on her body. That doesn't make sense. So this whole suicide thing is just illogical.
What's interesting about Cleopatra is that she doesn't fit the profile of those leaders who, when they lose, commit suicide. I mean, she can go through losses and still persevere. She's a survivor. So the idea that she would, in the face of a loss, commit suicide just doesn't hold water.
The investigation so far seems to contradict the idea that Cleopatra committed suicide either by snakebite or poisoning. And Brown's experience on modern suicide cases is making her suspicious. She realizes there is one crucial clue which makes the theory implausible: the note. Accounts say that before her death, Cleopatra wrote a suicide note and sent it to her captor, Octavian.
That's not what people do when they really want to commit suicide. People don't write suicide notes and give them to other people. They usually write the suicide note to leave them by their bodies.
This revelation changes Brown's investigation into a murder inquiry.
Right now, I'm at the point where I do not believe it was possible, really, for Cleopatra to commit suicide. So that leaves us with one other conclusion, which would be homicide.
Pat Brown is now on the hunt for Cleopatra's killer.
I'm going to be looking for somebody who had the opportunity, the ability, and the motive to commit this crime against Cleopatra.
And Brown already has a suspect in mind: Cleopatra's captor, Octavian.
Well, and only one person who controlled the crime scene. So I'd say Octavian looks like a very good suspect.
For Brown, Octavian is the prime suspect in Cleopatra's suspicious death. Now, she has to prove it. The grandnephew of Julius Caesar, Octavian was named as his heir. He inherited Caesar's desire to transform Rome into a great empire under one all-powerful ruler, himself.
His plan was to gain sole power. He wanted to gain all of the honors and positions that he was entitled to.
There was one obstacle in Octavian's path: a man who shared his ambition to rule Rome alone: Mark Antony. After Caesar's death, Octavian controlled the western half of the Roman Empire, while Mark Antony ruled the eastern half. It was at this time, just as Caesar had before him, that he began a relationship with Cleopatra. Octavian used their liaison as a weapon, leading a vicious smear campaign against the couple.
He used Mark Antony's relationship with Cleopatra to create an image of Mark Antony that was denigrating, that presented him as unmanned by this Egyptian whore.
Octavian cannot attack Mark Antony, who is his rival, so he will attack Cleopatra and create a myth about her, which is everything that Rome hates. She uses sex to lure these poor men. She's a murderess, and they describe her as a prostitute.
Finally, the confrontation escalated into a full-blown war. At stake was the chance to be the sole ruler of the empire. Octavian played a calculated game.
When Octavian actually declares war, he chooses to declare war on Cleopatra. And in doing so, he turns this war into a war against a foreign queen, rather than into a war against another Roman general.
Octavian won the war. His victory was devastating. When Egypt was conquered, Mark Antony committed suicide. Cleopatra was taken prisoner. Octavian finally had control of the entire empire. Pat Brown's psychological profile is beginning to take shape.
He is a brilliant chess player. He's trying to eliminate her bit by bit. And when it comes down to the crime scene, the last days of Cleopatra's life, there he is. He's in Alexandria. He's got control of the mausoleum. And now he's going to call the shots, and he's going to make happen what he wants to happen.
But there's one thing which contradicts the idea that Octavian killed Cleopatra. The ancient sources say he wanted her alive, that he planned to humiliate her by displaying her in a triumphant procession through the streets of Rome.
It was quite a common practice to take the vanquished kings of foreign countries and show them off in Rome.
And if Octavian was planning on publicly humiliating Cleopatra, then he would have no motive for killing her. In search of clues, Pat Brown travels to Rome to try and find out more about Octavian's character. Expert Dr. Lori-Ann Touchette takes her to the site of the Roman Forum. Here, Octavian built a lavish temple to his chosen deity, Mars, god of war.
We're coming up the steps of the Temple of Mars Ultor that was dedicated by Augustus to Mars the Avenger.
So he's continuing the tradition of relating himself to the gods to give him that kind of power in front of the people.
Absolutely. It's interesting that just after Octavian arrives in Rome, one of his first acts is to hold games. What happened? The games began. A comet appeared in the sky. And so Octavian could present this comet as Caesar, who indeed was a god. From that point on, he calls himself Divi Filius, son of the divine.
How lucky for him.
He actually has to rewrite himself in the same way that he manufactured an image of Cleopatra.
As what?
Create himself as the savior of Rome. It's clear that if Mark Antony had won, we would have a very different vision of him.
For Pat Brown, Octavian's obvious ability to manipulate his public image is suspicious. Is it possible that he also used spin to change the story of Cleopatra's death?
Octavian is a master of propaganda. When the story of Cleopatra takes place, he's really only at the beginning of his career. So he has time, power, and the intelligence to build a whole world of myth, of propaganda.
A key piece of evidence is Octavian's grandiose memoirs entitled The Accomplishments of the Divine Augustus. Some believe these memoirs influenced the work of Roman historians Plutarch and Dio Cassius.
There's some suggestion that they were actually following the memoirs of Augustus. And so we have this possibility that they're presenting Augustus's own view how he wants to see the suicide of Cleopatra portrayed.
Perhaps Octavian himself had created the idea that he had wanted to take Cleopatra alive as another piece of propaganda. Could it be that he was just trying to cover his tracks?
When one analyzes the issues, one sees a very odd thing, that there are more reasons to want her dead than to want to drag her through the streets in this triumph. The best enemy is a dead enemy. And if Cleopatra lived to go to the triumph in Rome, who knows what would have happened. Octavian probably considered this very well and thought, it's not worth it.
Brown has discovered that Octavian had both the opportunity and an alibi for Cleopatra's murder. But did he have a motive for a cold-blooded killing?
Everyone needs a reason to kill. They don't just do it. Even what people call a motiveless crime is not motiveless, it's only we don't understand it.
Pat Brown's investigation has now cast serious doubts on the accepted version of Cleopatra's death, suicide by snakebite. She's even dismissed the alternative theory of poisoning. She believes that Cleopatra was murdered, and she's closing in on a possible killer, Octavian. Now Brown is hunting for the final piece of evidence. She wants to discover the motive.
And here is Cleopatra to the left, wearing the crown of upper-in-law Egypt.
Alongside her, depicted as co-ruler, is her son Caesarion. It's a significant clue.
Cleopatra is showing him here as the future king. And she is trying to say that he will be able to rule the whole world.
Brown believes Gohary has found the motive in Cleopatra's son, Caesarion. He posed a serious threat to Octavian. As son of Julius Caesar, he had a claim to the thrones of both Egypt and Rome.
She becomes co-ruler with Caesarion, setting him up to take his place as the rightful heir of Caesar.
The child is the threat to Rome. I mean, Cleopatra is a threat in her own right, but the child is the biggest threat of all because he is the direct descendant of Julius Caesar, who has no other children.
Pat Brown believes that Octavian would have stopped at nothing to destroy Cleopatra and Caesarion.
Looking at this depiction, I can really see why Cleopatra was such a threat. This wasn't a woman he could buy off easily. This wasn't a woman who's going to go away. This is a woman who saw herself and her son ruling over a huge empire, and she was always going to be a thorn in the side of Octavian.
Caesarion's fate may in itself hint at Octavian's determination to rid himself of Cleopatra and her heirs. Just days before Octavian arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra sent the 17-year-old Caesarion to Ethiopia, hoping to protect him. But after Cleopatra's death, Octavian had him hunted down and killed.
It's interesting that our sources brush over the murder of Caesarion. It's not seen as an important issue, and again, I think we're dealing with Augustan propaganda, with his ability to rewrite history after the time.
Finally, Cleopatra's demise is making sense to Brown. Drawing on all her evidence from the investigation, she has reconstructed what she believes to be a plausible account of Cleopatra's death. It is not history's version, but her own. Cleopatra, last pharaoh of Egypt, is imprisoned in her mausoleum following the fall of Alexandria to her rival, Octavian. Her lover, Mark Antony, is already dead.
Octavian faced a very difficult choice. He could keep her alive and have this wonderful triumph, or he could kill her and eliminate the threat he had in his life and into his future. That was the true goal he was seeking, and therefore I believe he chose to murder Cleopatra rather than take her to Rome. so he sends his men to do the job for him. He's got total secrecy there, and he can control everything and make it look like a suicide. So he wanted to murder her, but he wanted to make sure that that murder was not attached to him. And then he could create a story to distance himself from that crime. He simply says, I wasn't there. This is a wonderful cover-up.
Could Brown's theory be correct? Will the theory hold up under scrutiny? Nicole Jewick, an expert on the life and death of Cleopatra, has examined her case.
Pat Brown's conclusions are certainly worthy of more attention. What she has done could inspire people like me and others to think again, why not? I believe that certainly the story is not what is the accepted tale.
Other experts agree. Brown has finally addressed the mysteries surrounding Cleopatra's death.
She was not that woman that could be defeated easily. She always looked at the future. I think that she was killed in a different way.
At last, Brown is satisfied that the case can be closed.
It's been 2,000 years since Cleopatra's death, but I believe that it was a murder, and I believe we found the murderer.
Cleopatra was 39 years old when she died. With her death, 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization came to an end. Octavian captured Egypt, and the once great nation became just another province of the vast Roman Empire. But Cleopatra may have ultimately won the war. The extraordinary stories of her life and death created a powerful myth, and her legacy is still remembered today. By using modern science and investigative techniques, it's possible that the myths surrounding her death have finally been dispelled. The psychological profile has painted a detailed picture, not only of a victim, but of one of the most extraordinary rulers the world has ever seen.